When the world feels dangerous, what's our first instinct? It's to build a fortress, right? We build walls, we dig moats, we create these safe spaces because it just seems like the logical thing to do. But what if that very fortress, the one you built for your own protection, actually becomes the thing that brings you down? Let's dive into that paradox. And this right here, this is the core idea we're going to unpack. And it's a powerful one, because it runs counter to pretty much everything we think we know about staying safe. We're going to break down exactly why pulling yourself away from the world doesn't really protect you. In fact, it puts you in even greater danger. So let's look at this paradox. On one hand, you've got the promise of the fortress, right? Safety, control, power. That's the dream. But the reality of isolation is a twisted version of that. Safety turns into danger. Control, that becomes total blindness. And that power you thought you had, it just makes you an easy target. And believe me, there is no better example of this tragic flip than the story of one of the most powerful men in all of history. So let's talk about our case study, Qin Shi Huangdi. This was the very first emperor of a unified China. We're talking about a guy who commanded an empire that was bigger and more powerful than Alexander the Great's. This is the big leagues. I mean, people who wrote about him at the time said he had the voice of a jackal and the heart of a tiger or wolf. He was absolutely ruthless, incredibly cunning, and just fiercely ambitious. And he used all of that to unify China through this brutal mix of violence, scheming, and a will that just would not break. And look, his achievements were absolutely monumental. In 221 BC, he ends centuries of nonstop war by conquering all his rivals. Then he standardizes everything: laws, writing, even the width of the axles on chariots. And of course, he's the one who connected all those existing walls to create what we now know as the Great Wall of China. The man had total control. But here it is. This is the crucial turning point. In his obsession with absolute control, he makes a fatal decision. He outlaws the teachings of Confucius, which were literally the bedrock of Chinese culture. He burned the books. He executed scholars. In one single move, he created countless enemies and planted the seeds of a paranoia that would completely consume him. And that act of suppression, that's the moment the emperor's fears started to get real, to become physical. He began building his fortress, not just out of stone, but out of secrecy and isolation, pulling back from the very world that he had built. The sheer scale of his paranoia was just staggering. This number you see, 270, that's how many interconnected pavilions he had in his massive palace. He basically built this giant labyrinth for one single purpose: to hide. So what was his first paranoid tactic? Well, he never slept in the same room twice. He figured this constant movement would mess up the plans of any would-be assassins. He literally became a ghost in his own home. And then his paranoia just got worse. He made a new rule. Anyone who even accidentally saw his face would be executed on the spot. Think about that. He was systematically erasing himself from the world, turning his own presence into a deadly secret. And this was the final stage of his self-imposed prison. His location became a top state secret. Only a handful of ministers and eunuchs knew where he was, and they were all sworn to silence, or else. He really believed he had achieved total, perfect safety. Or so he thought. And here is the tragic, just pathetic irony of his entire life. The most powerful man on earth dies suddenly while traveling in disguise. And to keep his death a secret from the empire, his body was carted back to the capital next to a wagon full of salted fish, just to cover up the smell of his own body decaying. He died completely and utterly alone, with just a couple of eunuchs, far from everyone he knew. What an incredible story, right? But what's the actual lesson here? Let's decode exactly how the emperor's fortress of isolation led directly to his downfall. So it really boils down to these three critical failures. First, when you hide, you're cut off from valuable intelligence. You just don't hear what's really happening out there. Second, you lose all sense of proportion. Little threats seem huge, big threats seem small. You can't judge reality anymore. And third, and this is the big one, instead of making you safe, it makes you a concentrated, predictable target for the very people who are closest to you. And here's the ultimate irony. Who were his real enemies? Well, historians are pretty sure that the very minister and eunuchs who encouraged his isolation The ones who controlled all access to him were the same ones who likely poisoned him. His fortress didn't keep his enemies out, it trapped him inside with them. Okay, so this is obviously not just some 2,000-year-old history lesson. This is about us, right here, right now. It's time to turn this whole analysis inward and see how it applies to our own lives. So this brings us to the really important question. What kind of walls are you putting up? Maybe it's at work, where you've stopped listening to real feedback. Or maybe it's in your personal life, where you're shutting people out. These modern fortresses, they all operate on the exact same flawed principle. So if isolation is the poison, then what in the world is the antidote? Well, the answer isn't to be defenseless. It's about finding a different, much smarter kind of defense. The key is all about staying connected. You have to be close enough to the action to hear the whispers, the gossip, the rumblings of what's really going on. That information from the ground level, that's your lifeblood. It's your early warning system. See, by moving among people, by building alliances, and just by staying connected, you create a totally different kind of protection. You're no longer one single isolated target. You become part of a dynamic network. The crowd isn't a threat. It turns out, it's your shield. So what's the first brick you can take down from your own fortress today?